met him. Dr. Perry is revising his dissertation right now for publication as a monograph. And the title of his dissertation, also the title of his talk for today is Statelessness and Contested Sovereignty in the Middle East, the United States, Palestinian Refugees, the Muslim Brotherhood, Syrian Ethnic Minorities, and the Early Cold War from 1945 to 1954. Dr. Perry received his PhD in history from the University of Kentucky in 2021. His teaching and research interests include the history of the United States in the world, global Cold War history, modern Middle East history, empire, and decolonization. Welcome, John, and this is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope everyone's having a good new year. I'll try to pull up my presentation here. I'll share the screen. Do I need to get permission to share my screen? I think.
You need to be made co-host, I think. Hi, Jing, or whoever's host, look in the participants. Okay.
Okay, here we go. Yep.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Let's see here. Is everyone able to see that? Yes, all right, thank you. So as Jing mentioned, the title of my dissertation is Statelessness and Contested Sovereignty in the Middle East, the United States, Palestinian Refugees, and Muslim Brotherhood, Syrian Ethnic Minorities in the early Cold War, 1945 to 1954. I was going for the longest dissertation title possible. But to get started, basically just to let you know what my overall argument of this presentation is going to be, is that ultimately non-state actors, non-state groups such as Palestinian refugees, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Syria's Kurds are fundamentally going to transform how the early Cold War plays out in the Middle East. I'm going to argue that these actors and other non-state actors like them really defined and then redefined the policies and strategies of the United States in the Middle East. Now, traditionally, the historians have looked at the Cold War through the lens of state-to-state relations. So they've looked at the ways in which the United States interact with the Soviet Union, the ways in which the superpowers have interacted with European governments, and the ways in which all of these governments interacted with third world governments. And this is really the traditional way in which the Cold War has been studied. I challenge these state-centric frameworks by arguing that it was really these non-state actors who are going to dictate how the Cold War plays out in the third world, and specifically with regards to the Middle East. So I'm really sort of trying to move the focus onto these non-state groups. Furthermore, I argue that looking at groups like the refugees, looking at groups like Syrian ethnic minorities and the Muslim Brotherhood, it really demonstrates a lot of the limitations to the post-colonial nation state within the Middle East and the third world generally. These actors are not going to fit into the new modes of power that come into being as a result of the nation state system that's largely imposed on the Middle East. Whereas under empire, there was something called a politics of difference that really much better incorporated unlike populations into the system, much better than the nation state. Under empire, by its very nature, it needed a system that could reach out and incorporate different peoples, unlike populations, and then incorporate them into this system with varying peoples. Under the nation state, really like a singular people is attempted to be created, really a homogenous people that really focuses on borders, focuses on those within the nation state borders, and focuses on excluding those outside the nation state. And when this nation state system comes into being, the groups of my study are going to be left outside of these new modes of power. And that's ultimately going to be why they have and continue to challenge the nation state system that was imposed on the Middle East by European powers during World War I, which I'll talk about in a moment. So again, just as a reminder, not only do the groups of my study really demonstrate the significance of non-state actors with regards to the Cold War, they demonstrate the significance of the limitations of the post-colonial nation state in the Middle East. So this is my overall argument to my presentation. With regards to the literature that's been written on the early Cold War, as well as the actors of my study, like I mentioned, traditionally, historians have looked at the Cold War through the lens of state-to-state relations, and I'm really challenging that by focusing on non-state actors. However, I'm also really challenging a lot of the work that looks at Palestinian refugees, ethnic minorities like the Kurds and the Armenians, and to a certain extent, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood as well, that really sort of paint these actors as victims, as actors without agency, actors who are living in a world that is somewhat out of their control, that they're really just sort of reacting to events, reacting to larger powers. My work is really sort of challenging this literature and saying that far from victims, groups like Palestinian refugees, ethnic minorities, or religious organizations were major agents of change in this time period. That really in key ways, they define the history of the United States in the Middle East and the history of the modern Middle East generally. So just with regards to the historiography, I just wanted to give a brief note on where my work sort of fits within that literature. So just moving forward from here, I just want to give you a brief outline on how my presentation is going to proceed. So I'm just going to talk real quickly about some of the research that I've done, what archives I've used. I'll then give a brief background, brief context for looking at the three groups of my study, and then we'll move into those groups being the Palestinian refugees, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Syria's Kurds, and then we'll wrap everything up with a conclusion. So to get started, I did much of my research at the American University of Beirut and at Tel Aviv University. There I researched Arabic newspapers, Arabic newsletters, Arabic magazines. I really focused on those sources that talk about what's going on with Palestinian refugees, that talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood itself had a number of different publications, which I researched at, as I mentioned, at University of Beirut in Lebanon, and Tel Aviv University at the Moshe Dayan Center in Tel Aviv University. As well, I researched English language sources, the National Archives and Records Administration. There I focused on government officials, not only the top tier of policymaking, such as the president or the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. I really tried to focus as well on the second and third tiers of policymaking. Specifically, I was looking at those individuals who were on the ground in the Middle East. So those US officials who were working in the embassies in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, whatever it is. As well, I also used the CIA record search tool. This has a ton of online resources, and I also use the United Nations Archives and Records Management section to look at what's going on with regards to sort of the international community and how they're looking at the groups of my study and sort of the developments that they're involved with. So moving forward from my research. So from here, we'll just turn to I'll give you a brief bit of context, a little bit of background information. So at the end of World War II, it's really just the United States and the Soviet Union left standing. And the idea of going to war with the Soviet Union, of World War III breaking out, although it sounds a bit silly to us today, was a real possibility for US policymakers in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The idea that we could go to war was so real that US policymakers developed a number of different plans in case that war with the Soviets did break out. One thing that American policymakers did calculate was that if war broke out with the Soviet Union would be able to roll over Europe, including Western Europe, and there would be very little that the United States or the Western powers could do about it. However, they calculated that the way that this would be countered would be up through the Middle East and under the into the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union. So the Middle East is going to become one of the strategically most important regions in the world to US policymakers in the immediate post-World War II period. Europe is first, East Asia is second, but the Middle East is a very, very, very close third, and it becomes crucially important to US policymakers. One of the primary aims US officials are going to attempt to attain is to create a security network for the region like that of NATO, in the event of a Soviet invasion. They want to unite these countries in the Middle East into a security apparatus to defend the region, not just against Soviet invasion, but as well as Soviet influence from developing. It's vitally important for US officials that they prevent any kind of Soviet influence from developing in the oil-rich region of the Middle East. However, the United States is going to inherit an extremely unstable situation in the Middle East. So the Middle East had been really under the hegemony of Western powers, of colonial powers like the British and the French for several decades. During World War I, the British and the French are going to get together and really start to draw up what remains of the Ottoman Empire and divide it up into who gets what. So on the map we see here, we can see that the French are going to get the bluish color. The British get that your sort of yellowish brownish color. And these are going to become colonies of the British and the French. They're going to use the term mandates, but it means the same thing as colony ultimately. And it's going to be these mandates that will also ultimately determine the borders of the nation state system that's imposed on the Middle East. So the British and the French are going to draw these borders, and there's going to be no input whatsoever from local and native populations. The British and the French are really just going to end up drawing these lines that make up Syria, that make up Iraq and Jordan. As you can see, the nation state system is going to correlate somewhat similarly to the mandates that these two powers have. So this is going to leave things extremely unstable in the Middle East by the World War II period. Protests, demonstrations, riots, attacks, bombings, shootings are rampant throughout the region, and it's largely in relation to continued colonial intervention, continued colonial rule in the Middle East. Peoples of Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, whatever it is, their primary aim by the end of World War II is to remove these colonial influences, to remove any sort of colonial power from their countries. Many, if not most of these countries are going to side with the Allies during World War II ultimately and fight for them. And they argue that we've done our part. It's now time to give us our freedom. So this is really sort of the situation that the United States inherits at the end of World War II. The Middle East, however, is still largely a British responsibility. The United States looks at Britain as having the most responsibility within the region. This is going to change from 45 to 56, however. From 45 to 56, we're going to see a shift where the United States is going to begin to replace Great Britain as the primary power in the region, and ultimately as the power that has the most responsibility for combating the Soviet Union and the development of communism in the region. So this is really the context that really is going to start our story when we turn to the first group of my study, the Palestinian refugees. So that's just a bit of background information. So we'll turn to the first group, Palestinian refugees, and their story as well is going to begin largely with World War I. So as we mentioned, after World War I, much of the Middle East is going to become a mandate of Great Britain and France. Palestine is to become controlled by Great Britain. Great Britain is going to authorize migration by Jewish populations into Palestine. And we're going to see waves of Jewish migrants who are going to go to Palestine to begin to set up a new life. It's going to begin to really pick up speed in the 1920s and 1930s, so much so that by the mid-1930s, significant conflict develops between the new Jewish migrants, the British who are running the colony, and the local Palestinian inhabitants. A series of conflicts are going to erupt in the mid-1930s, and there's going to be something called the First Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939, where the local Palestinian population is really going to rise up and try to get rid of British authority to prevent further Jewish migration to Palestine. The British are going to, after they get this under control, come to the realization that they can't continue to allow this large number of Jewish migrants to go to Palestine without creating further conflict. So in 1939, the British are going to cut off further immigration by Jewish populations. Perhaps not entirely, but they're going to limit it severely. And this is one of the sort of historic ironies of this time period, is that when the Jewish people could have used a haven, perhaps more than any other time period, because the Holocaust is beginning in 1939, the British are going to cut off further immigration to Palestine. It's just one of these sort of side notes, but it's an interesting sort of irony. However, after World War II, the British are going to reopen the idea of continued migration to Palestine, somewhat in response to the Holocaust, to try to give the Jewish people a new haven, a new place where they can begin to start anew. And this, unsurprisingly, is going to set off new conflict with the local inhabitants, not just in Palestine, but throughout the Middle East. President Harry Truman is going to endorse the migration of a new round of 100,000 Jewish migrants to go to Palestine after World War II. And this is going to set off a series of protests, demonstrations, strikes, and riots, not only in Palestine, but throughout the Middle East. So even before the announcement of a new round of Jewish migrants to Palestine, the entire region had already been protesting Western intervention, had already been protesting the British, the French. And so when this happens, this is just going to intensify the conflict that's on the ground. Shootings, bombings, and attacks are going to start to rise in relation to support to this idea of further immigration. And we're going to see that things are going to begin to really sort of ratchet up quite significantly and quite quickly. Ultimately, what the United Nations comes up with is a plan to partition the country. The United States is going to endorse this plan in 1947. What we see here on the picture on the left, this is theoretically what was supposed to happen with partition. We can see that the bluish color was supposed to be the Jewish state, and then the yellowish brown was supposed to be the Palestinian state. However, what actually ends up happening, for many, many, many reasons, unfortunately I don't have time to go into them, but what ends up happening is more in line what we see in the picture on the right here, where the picture on the right, we can see that the blue is the Palestinian territory, the black is the Jewish territory, and we can see how over time that largely becomes inverted. And after this plan is announced in 1947, we're going to have the First Arab-Israeli War, where when Israel is declared, the neighboring Arab states are going to go to war with Israel to try to prevent this from happening. And this is going to set off the refugee crisis. When this war breaks out, we're going to see that hundreds of thousands of refugees are going to flood into neighboring countries. I think by 1949, there's going to be 250,000 in Egypt, 90,000 in Jordan, 300,000 in Palestine, 90,000 in Lebanon, and 100,000 in Syria. And these refugees are going to be living in really sort of horrendous makeshift camps that really are just very, very unbearable to live in. I mean, crime, rape, disease, these are going to be extremely prevalent within these camps. But furthermore, these camps are going to put tremendous strain on the communities that house them, and the communities that house them are going to put tremendous strain on their local and national governments to do something about it. So most of the blame, whether rightly or wrongly, is going to be placed on the United States. So not just by the Palestinians, but populations throughout the Middle East are going to see the United States as holding the most responsibility for this crisis. And this is going to play a very important role in framing US Middle East relations moving forward. It's going to be extremely difficult for any nation, any Arab nation in the Middle East now to work with the United States, because even being perceived to work with the United States can set off protests, demonstrations, riots, attacks, bombings that can, and as we will see, did ultimately lead to revolutions and regime changes. So it now becomes extremely dangerous for any Arab regime to work with the United States because of the civil and domestic conflict that can erupt just simply by being seen as working with the US. On the other hand, we can see that the refugees themselves are going to become deeply, deeply troubling to US policymakers. US officials are going to become deeply disturbed by the camps themselves because they're going to begin to see them as hotbeds of communism. They're going to interpret these refugee camps as places where the Soviets are recruiting, training, building agents, creating new operations, and they become one of the focus of US policymakers. They see them as one of the most dangerous aspects of Middle East instability. So we're going to see is that the anti-colonialism of the refugees, as well as groups throughout the Middle East, will often be interpreted by US officials as communism. And this too sort of frames the way in which US policymakers waged the Cold War in the Middle East. They often equate anti-colonial nationalism with that of communism, and that affects their ability to interpret the situation. And as we're going to see moving forward, it's often to the negative. So this is the first group of my study, Palestinian refugees, and they're going to really sort of provide the framework for how US Middle East relations are going to play out. From here, we'll turn to the second group of my study, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, which will give us a little bit more of a lens that zeroes in on a specific country, and specifically Egypt. So the Muslim Brotherhood was initially just a small local club that began in 1928 by an individual named Hassan al-Banna. Originally, it was just a place for individuals to voice communal concerns, a place to create just a community, a culture, place for fraternity, but it's going to very quickly explode in popularity. In the 1930s, it's going to develop a very anti-British, anti-colonial platform, and this is going to lead it to really sort of explode in popularity. Now, to understand this, we have to understand the British in Egypt. So by 1945, the British have had a military presence in Egypt since 1882, when they're first going to occupy the country. Once they're there, they're never going to leave. They've by this point set up a puppet monarchy. The British are really running the show from behind the scenes. So the primary concern for most Egyptians is to get the British out of the country. The British still have around 100,000 troops stationed at the vitally important Suez Canal. And Egypt ultimately sided with the Allies during World War II, so they feel that they've done their part and they should have their freedom now. So the primary concern, one of the few concerns that unites almost all Egyptians in this time period, is the idea that they need to remove the British. And this helps explain how the Muslim Brotherhood is going to go from this very small little club to an organization that by the 1940s, the end of World War II, has hundreds of thousands of official members, and it has millions of sympathizers and supporters. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood by the post-World War II period is going to be so popular that it's going to have the power really to challenge the state whenever it wants. Anytime the Egyptian state implements a policy or announces a new alliance, or any sort of edict that the government issues that the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't like, they can immediately rally tens of thousands of people onto the streets, and they carry out demonstrations, protests, riots, strikes, anytime the government issues something that they don't like. However, they also carry out assassinations, bombings, and guerrilla attacks as well. Now, this is going to be the extreme wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which I'll get to in a moment. But the point here is that the Muslim Brotherhood has the power to challenge the state. In many ways, it's as powerful as the state in this time period. And this is because of the presence of the British, because of the country's history of colonialism. The Muslim Brotherhood seems to be the only organization really willing to stand up to the British. The monarchy itself seems to be really just a puppet. Now, this is going to play a very important role on US-Egyptian relations. So the Muslim Brotherhood's ability to influence the state is going to really dictate US-Egyptian relations. So one of the primary aims of US officials with regards to Egypt is to enlist Egypt into that security network to unify the region, to prevent Soviet influence from developing, as well as countermeasures in the event of a Soviet invasion. They want Egypt to take the lead in creating this security apparatus for many different reasons. Egypt has often been looked at as sort of a leader amongst the Arab world. It has an ancient history that stretches back thousands of years. So American policymakers want Egypt to take the lead in this. And one of their aims throughout the late 1940s and 1950s is to enlist Egypt into this security network. And the Egyptian government makes it clear that they want to join this network too, that they want to work with the United States. However, anytime the Egyptian government flirts with the US aims, US plans, the Muslim Brotherhood instantly sets off a demonstration, sets off a bombing, has an assassination attempt. And it's going to be the Muslim Brotherhood that is going to prevent Egypt from ever joining a US-led security network for the Middle East. And this is really an important aspect, because this is one of the primary aims of US officials within the Middle East. Now, once we get to 1948 and we get to the First Arab-Israeli War and the refugee crisis, we're going to see things in Egypt go from critical to catastrophic. There were already regular bombings, already regular attacks and riots. And now we're going to see, after 1948, we're going to see these things increase exponentially. Furthermore, it's going to be in 1948 when the Egyptian government discovers something called the Secret Apparatus. Now, this was the extreme wing of the Muslim Brotherhood that I mentioned. They're going to discover that this is an entire wing of the organization that's devoted solely to planning, recruiting, and carrying out assassinations, bombings, guerrilla attacks, acquiring and storing arms and ammunition. And as a result of this, the Egyptian government is going to outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood. And they're going to ban them from society. The Muslim Brotherhood is going to be forced underground. However, at the same time, there is a group of young officers who are planning to overthrow the Egyptian government to finally free Egypt and get rid of the British. However, they're unable to carry out these plans on their own, so they develop a plan secretly with the Muslim Brotherhood, whereby the Muslim Brotherhood supports them in their coup, and then in return, the free officers will reinstate the Muslim Brotherhood once they're in power. And it's going to be this brief union of convenience between the free officers and the Muslim Brotherhood that's going to allow Nasser to come to power in his bloodless coup in July of 1952. Without the Muslim Brotherhood, the free officers would not have been able to carry out this coup as easily or as bloodlessly as they did. However, once the free officers attain power, we're going to see factionalism develop, not just between the new government, but also within within the Muslim Brotherhood. So in the picture here, we have Nasser on the right, and then we have Colonel Mohammed Naguib on the left. Naguib is going to be elected president of the new regime. And the Muslim Brotherhood is going to throw itself behind Naguib. They're going to support Naguib because he is more in line with the policies they want to see Egypt have. Naguib is far more open to creating a religious state, which is ultimately what the Muslim Brotherhood desires for Egypt, whereas Nasser is moving towards a much more secular, much more modern state. So we'll see that Naguib and the Muslim Brotherhood are going to ultimately come into conflict with Nasser. And there's one final component to this, is the secret apparatus of the Muslim Brotherhood. By this point, has broken off entirely from the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood and is now waging war against the entirety of the Egyptian state. So it's waging war not just against Nasser, but also against Naguib and the majority faction of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we have these factions developing. Ultimately, Nasser is going to be successful. He's going to be successful in both defeating his domestic political opponents, the faction supporting Naguib, as well as he's going to be able to liquidate the Muslim Brotherhood after an assassination attempt is made on his life. This is going to give him the reasoning to finally liquidate the organization, and the organization is going to be forced underground. until the 1970s, when Nasser's successor is going to be looking for a way to legitimize his rule. And much like the free officers did in 1952, the way he decides to legitimize his rule is by reinstating the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1970s. So they never really go away, the Muslim Brotherhood. Even today, it's still the Brotherhood and the army that are really struggling for control of Egypt. It's still these two primary factions that are struggling for control. But the point to take away with regards to this time period is that the Muslim Brotherhood is playing really a crucial role in how the United States approaches Egypt with regards to the Cold War. They're going to prevent the United States from enlisting Egypt into the security network. They're also going to play a primary role in bringing Nasser to power, who's going to play an extremely important role, not just with regards to the Cold War in the Middle East, but with regards to inspiring third world leaders throughout the world. He's going to be someone who many anti-colonial movements are going to look to for inspiration. So again, the Muslim Brotherhood playing an important role with regards to how the Cold War plays out in Egypt. So this was the second group of my study. From here, we'll turn to the third and final group, which is going to be the Kurds of Syria. The Kurds are going to be one of the many ethnic minorities within Syria. However, their homeland stretches across many different countries. Now, there's a lot going on with this map. The only thing we really need to take away from is that this reddish, brownish, dark red color here, this is the territory traditionally of the Kurds' homeland. However, with Sykes-Picot in 1918 and the British and the French creating the borders of the region, we can see that the Kurdish homeland is going to be split now between Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. So from the moment that their homeland is split up, there is going to be movements that develop that are aiming to create a Kurdish homeland. And these movements haven't gone away. They're still with us today. But this is going to be one of the primary aims of the Kurds in Syria, is developing some homeland, because they're completely left outside the new modes of power, having their home split between all these new nation states. So when we turn to Syria in the immediate post-World War II period, Syria is going to be in a similar situation to that of Egypt. It's going to be controlled by the French. However, the Syrians are going to be more successful in that they're going to free themselves from the French in about a year's time period after the end of World War II. So by 1946, they're going to force the French out of the region. But this is going to present a number of different problems for U.S. policymakers in the country. When the Syrians finally force the French out of their country, the Syrians are going to begin to move towards democratic institutions. However, U.S. policymakers are going to see this as playing in favor of the Soviet Union. They're going to sort of interpret the Syrians as being unable to properly create democratic institutions, as not having the will or the ability to implement democratic change properly. And they begin to see threats everywhere. So not only is there a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, so there's the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. We also have the refugee crisis. There is a strong communist party in Syria. But we also have these ethnic minorities like the Kurds and the Armenians, who US policymakers interpret as these dangerous Soviet-backed populations who are working with the Soviet Union, aiming to overthrow the government and put a Soviet-backed regime in place. Now, it is true that the Kurds and the Armenians are going to develop strong connections with the Soviet Union. However, again, this is another instance of anti-colonial nationalism being interpreted as communism. The Kurds, the Armenians, who are in a similar situation to the Kurds, they're looking for any power, whether that's the United States or the Soviet Union, to back them in gaining a homeland, to support them in gaining a country, a home that they can call their own. So it's not so much that they're interested in communism, or rather they're interested in a great power, any great power that will help them gain their homeland back. So we're going to see that U.S. policymakers are going to interpret these groups as dangerous Soviet-backed populations that are really running amok in the country. And this is going to lead U.S. policymakers to support an individual named Husni Zaim, who is going to implement a coup in March of 1949. Now, there's no direct evidence that I'm aware of that really proves the U.S. helped Zaim with this coup. However, I'm inclined to believe that the United States, at the very least, provided some semblance of intelligence or logistics to Zaim in the coup of 1949. Whether they helped him or not, it's very clear that once Zaim comes to power, the U.S. supports him. They immediately start backing Zaim. They immediately start to see the country as having direction. They immediately start to pour more resources into the country, specifically with regards to something called a tap line. So US policymakers have been developing this project to carry oil from Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean, but to do this, they need to build a pipeline that crosses the Middle East and goes through Syria. Zaim, one of his first edicts once he comes to power is to approve this tap line. And again, we see that the US is obviously very pleased with this and continues to support Zaim. However, Zaim is going to be absolutely brutal in suppressing any resistance to his rule. And very quickly, within a couple of months, he himself is going to be overthrown by an individual named Sami Hanawi, who is going to come to power in August of 1949. Again, the US is going to see him once he comes to power as someone that can help suppress any of the left-leaning, any of the communist sympathizers, any of the sort of Soviet influence developing in the country as someone who they can use to suppress this. However, Hanawi is going to last even a shorter time period than Zaim, and then the country is going to begin to move towards democratic institutions again. So the people are going to rise up, overthrow Hanawi, and then try to move towards democratic institutions. But within the historical record, it becomes clear that the United States is very, very deeply disturbed by that. A number of different US policymakers are going to go on record as saying that Syria is the most dangerous country in the Middle East in this time period because of the dangers of the various groups, including the Kurds and the Armenians, the danger that they pose within this country. And so we're going to find that the US policymakers are going to find a new individual who they're going to support, and this is going to be Shishakli's coup, which is going to occur in December. And again, we're going to see the same process play out, where once he's in power, the US supports them, sees the country as having direction. However, the people are going to resist this. And again, the people are sort of challenge these authoritarian rulers. And Shishakli is actually going to give up power and attempt to move the country back towards democratic institutions. But the same exact thing happens again, where it just seems like chaos when there isn't a strong man in power. Then in November of 1951, Shishakli is going to seize power once again. Once again, the US is going to support his policies, and he's going to be brutal in suppressing the people. But much like previously, the people are ultimately going to get fed up with him and overthrow him too. But the takeaway here ultimately is that when the country began to move towards democracy, the United States sees this as disorder, as chaos, and they see this as working towards the favor of the Soviet Union. They see this as really opening new doorways for the Soviet Union to penetrate into the Soviet Union. When the country has an authoritarian ruler, a dictator, they see the country as having direction. They see it as something that can be managed. They see it as something that's beneficial to US aims, to US strategy. But the dictatorships and the authoritarian individuals they support are going to be absolutely brutal to the local people, are going to be really very brutal in suppressing any sort of resistance, imprisoning people, restrictions on the press, basic liberties restricted, imprisonment, torture, executions are going to be rampant under these individuals. And this then frames US-Syrian relations moving forward, because this is obviously going to play a very strong role on the mindset of the people of Syria moving forward. We're going to see that in this time period, ultimately, the United States is going to begin to replace the British and the French as the primary foreign threat for most local Middle Eastern peoples. It's now moving in the direction of seeing the US as that great foreign power that's really intervening in the politics of Native society. And then finally, just to wrap up, to reiterate my conclusion, we have local stateless actors are going to ultimately transform the Cold War. They're going to define and then redefine US strategy, US policy. They're going to greatly complicate not only the strategies of the superpowers, but also of the local, national, and regional governments. They're going to really sort of dictate how the early Cold War plays out in this time period. And furthermore, they're going to demonstrate really the limits of this post-colonial nation state. As I mentioned, the nation state system is going to be imposed on the Middle East during the interwar period. But these groups and many others like them are not going to fit within these new modes of power. And because of that, they're going to really sort of challenge the nation state system and continue to challenge the nation state system. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perry. Thank you for sharing your fascinating work. And 45 minutes are really short for you to give us, so much on this very tumultuous period and area, and that is also still kind of influenced our everyday life even. So now I'm opening the floors to the audience because we have quite a few experts here and also very interested students. So feel free to unmute yourself and just share your questions, or you can use the chat and I will, Emma and I will keep monitoring our chat as well.
Any questions?
Jake?
Yes, a question. I don't know if I have like enough knowledge to like fully articulate this, but one of my geography, the geography professor, she left, Giulioli, for a bit, she briefly mentioned kind of now I might be getting a bit ahead of history here, the relationship between Palestinian refugees in Syria and the relationship to the government, how, and again, this is a bit ahead as we're talking